What is up, you guys? Welcome back to Tidal Gardens. Or what is more like the land of misfit, unfinished projects. So, this place is always very active in the way of projects, but I think that right this second is about as full of like half completed stuff as it's ever been. And while I'm not really much on New Year's resolutions, if I had to do a New Year's resolution, it would be no new projects until I got done with all of these. Let's take a moment and I'll show you around with what's all going on around here. All right, look at all of this stuff here. Usually this place is empty so that we can actually get some work done, but it is full of all these alu fab stands. And what's going on here is that we are doing a massive update next door in the greenhouse. And what we're going to be doing, hopefully, is transitioning from all of those cinder block stands, redoing the entire layout, and putting everything on aluminum stands and making everything a lot more efficient. Like a lot of the problem that we were having in the greenhouse area was it's basically a 20-year-old design, and it was something that made sense at the time, you know? Like 20 years ago, we kind of had to like maximize for the space that we had and, and try to like work with capacity issues, right? But we don't have capacity issues now. So right now I want to prioritize like ease of working. So for example, like next door, we do a lot of multi-tiered systems, which if you've been on this channel a while, you know that I don't like multi-tiered tanks. So all of these now are going to be single level tanks. And even the heights of these, like you want it to be basically at armpit level. And ideally, the armpit level of the people that are most likely to put their hands in the tanks. I'm the tallest person here, so ideally a little bit lower than my armpit, like that sort of thing, right? Because it turns out if you are just a little bit above, it strains your shoulder, and that adds up over time. So the tricky thing, though, is that whenever we need to do a big update like that, it's like trying to change a tire when you're rolling down the highway at 80 miles an hour. And that is in large part why it's taken us so long. Like, I wanted to do an update like this for about 10 years, but this is the first time that we've been able to shuffle that amount of livestock around and actually be able to break down a lot of these things. Several months ago, maybe even a year ago, we were able to redo all of the lighting canopies and stuff overhead. And that's fantastic. It's been wonderful, but that didn't involve moving livestock. And when you include the livestock step, it becomes very challenging to break down like a quarter of the greenhouse and shuffle things around, set up new stands and new tanks. Once we're done, though, the amount of gallons in the greenhouse will actually go down, but the amount of usable space is going to go up. There's a lot of wasted volume out there, and going from wasted volume to highly productive volume in a smaller space, that leaves a lot more room to do work in and around those tanks. So this has been a long time hope of mine, and finally it's getting underway. Oh, one thing I'd like to mention is when we purchased these glass aquariums, shoot, probably 10, 15 years ago, they were rimless. Over the years, I've learned that my preference is to have Eurobrace. And at the time, I only added just Eurobrace on this front section here. But now that we're basically going to be breaking all these tanks all the way down, redoing the bulkheads and all that stuff, replumbing everything, now is the time that if I wanted to, let's just go ahead and Eurobrace the entire thing. So just yesterday, I purchased all of like the glass pieces necessary. And so that's going to be like a small project that's going to yield a lot of usability. Eurobraces are tremendously helpful in our operation, just being able to set stuff on them. And when you have it even on the corners, you're able to put an entire tub of stuff on there, do your work, tub, do your work tub. It's not just like feeding cups and stuff like that. So tremendously valuable. It's something that we've wanted to get done for quite a while now, and we finally get to get caught up on that. Let's talk about these acrylic tanks for just a sec. I happened to get these acrylic tanks for free from my friend Sigi, who's Tech Gear Talk on YouTube. He was in the hobby like 20 years ago. That's how we met. He had these frag tanks that he hadn't used in forever. They were just sitting in his garage, and he gave them to me for free. Now, if you've been in this hobby a while, free tanks usually means a whole bunch of money to get them actually operational. A couple of things had to happen first. We needed to get stands, and we got these stands as a previous promotional thing with AluFab. They wanted to showcase their paneling system and as well as their black stuff. So very cool. At least we got that out of the way, right? Because like stands can be very expensive. Secondly, and this is probably a lot of user error, but these things are scratched to hell. And I've never fully restored an acrylic tank from heavily scratched to kind of that finished polish. First time for everything, I'm like, may as well give it a go. I got out the sander and went from like very rough grit, maybe like, I don't know, 500 grit, all the way to like 10,000 grit. And this is the result. It's cloudy. Since this time, I had a lot of talk with folks that really know what they're doing. When I was over in the Netherlands, I talked to Joe Yaulo as well as Florian from New Wave. And those guys have done a lot of this type of polishing work. And they said that what's most likely what happened was that I was doing the initial steps incorrectly, where I should have been using like wetted sandpaper rather than dry, because I was using it just dry. Supposedly, that makes all the difference in the world. So when I went from like the rough stuff all the way to like the ultra fine, I was basically polishing my own scratches. So one of these days, I also there's a big difference between like the good sandpaper and like the cheap Chinese stuff you find on Amazon. So I was using the cheap Chinese stuff. Do not do that. Get the good stuff. So this is like the 3M Trizact performance sandpaper. I've got 3,000 and 5,000 grit here. But yeah, I think that going with something like this would have yielded me better results. And also, again, use this stuff wet before then you get into like the polishing stages with like the liquid stuff. So anyways, this is so much elbow grease, even with like an orbital sander, that I will never do this again. It is so not worth it. But yeah, that's the major step that I needed to do with this. The other thing that I'll point out real quick is that because these things are, 15, 20 years old, they had goofy rear overflows. Back then, there wasn't really a consensus good idea for overflow boxes. So we actually fabricated out of 3/4 inch acrylic our own big, beefy overflows. And we're able to get, like the Maggie muffler systems into this. We've got the two drains, one to control the flow rate with a gate valve, and then the emergency. So going with something like this will make these guys a lot more functional. Hopefully, they'll be both functional and clear the next time you see them. Now, I haven't decided exactly what I want to do with these tanks. The most likely thing is this guy here will probably become a standalone anemone tank, and this larger one will be a quarantine tank for corals. We have two current quarantine tanks, and sometimes it would give us a lot more flexibility to have that third. All right, next up, I have a gigantic aquarium from the greenhouse in here. This was on our to-do list, no joke, for about a good solid 2 years. There's so much stuff in the way to get this thing extracted We never could accomplish it. We even bought this aluminum stand, literally years in advance just to get this guy out of the greenhouse more easily. But again, there's so much breakdown that has to happen there to finally get access to this and extract it. But this guy is an aquarium that was manufactured by Miracles Aquarium in Canada. And a local hobbyist, he never set it up, so I purchased it basically brand new, but for a used price. This is years ago. We set it up as a clam tank in the greenhouse. We've always referred to this thing as the clam tank. It hasn't had a clam in it for 10 years at least. Clams don't do that well here. Anyway, finally, this past week was the day because we were able to do so much of the tank breakdowns next door, get this guy out. And by the way, this is one of the situations where the leveling casters on an aluminum stand like this is a lifesaver. This tank is hundreds of pounds. And for us to like heft this thing out of that building, even though we've got like good suction cups and stuff, to heft this thing out of that building and onto a stand and make sure that stand is like in place and stuff would have been an absolute ridiculous nightmare. All we had to do for this was once we had access to that space, just basically deadlift it, get it on the stand, and then roll it casually out of that building and into this one. Super easy. Now, it is still up for debate what we will do with this tank. Right now, the debate is whether to give it its own sump, make it its own system, and have a lot more flexibility that way, or to potentially make it a little bit less maintenance by plumbing it directly into the existing sump. There's pros and cons to each. If we plumb it directly to that sump, that means that it's basically connected to the system. And so whenever we're doing maintenance on this system, it's part and parcel to that. The downside to that is that this thing kind of becomes its own refugium of sorts. And there might be things that just end up growing in this that now kind of populate the rest of the system. I think that right this second, we are leaning towards plumbing it in directly. And I'm not exactly sure what to do with this guy, what we would grow in it that we're not already growing in the rest of the system. There's a lot of flexibility. I think this guy is about 220 gallons. It measures 72 inches by 30 inches by what looks like 25, 26 inches tall. Fully Eurobraced. It's got a great gigantic overflow. Out of curiosity, with this tank, assuming we plumb it into a very robust system, what would you house into this? Would you make it a show tank or would you make it more of a production tank? Let me know in the comments. Okay, moving on. Do you guys remember this tank at all? It is a 150-gallon Planet Aquariums tank that at one time was plumbed down into an ancient life reef sump that I purchased more than 20 years ago. You see it sitting empty. And one of the reasons is we were never really happy with the overflow system in this, and we wanted to redo it in a much more bigger and more robust way. But this is a glass tank, not an acrylic tank like we were messing with over there. We kind of need to build it out of glass so that we can actually silicone it all together. But when you're making big overflow boxes in glass, it's very heavy. So we're kind of like hemming and hawing a little bit when it comes to like how best to reinforce it to make sure it doesn't like fall off of the back of the tank. But that's kind of why this guy's been empty. Funny story. This tank has gone through many phases and it's basically failed at every application that we've tried. Initially, the big brain thinking was to turn it into a quarantine tank for specifically things like Acropora, because Acropora, they tend to need an actual system, right? If when you're trying to just acclimate them and then keep them for like 30, 60 days in a smaller makeshift quarantine, they tend to die. Like that happens a lot. They're very sensitive. So they weren't getting enough flow. They didn't have like the right lighting profile. So we made an entire system just to quarantine them in. But what really messed us up was the height of this tank. anytime that you're talking about a tank that's more than 24 inches, it becomes more challenging to maintain. And when something like this becomes a little bit more challenging to maintain, it gets maintained less. That is not good when you have kind of like these delicate corals that probably aren't in the best shape because we're dipping them and stuff. The whole thing just didn't work out. So Acropore quarantine did not work. Then what did we do? We tried to do an anemone tank. For some reason, that went sour. I think that it got like a dinoflagellate bloom. Weirdly, don't know how. Everything else in here does not have dinoflagellate issues. This tank did. The anemones died. We tried to do it as an Aiptasia farm for Bergia nudibranchs. Well, what had happened was the nudibranchs did really well in this single tank. Even though this thing was full of Aiptasia, all of that stuff went away in like 3 weeks. There wasn't a single Aiptasia in here. We sold off all the nudibranchs, and then we're back to an empty tank. So we've gone through all these different iterations, but the next time around, what shall we do with this guy? We will probably try again with a standalone anemone tank. We tend to not like to mix different types of bubble tips. And so perhaps this tank here will be a species only for like something like Chicago sunburst or something like that. But first things first, we need to get that overflow fully constructed and installed, and fingers crossed it doesn't just like rip off by its own weight. Fun times. Okay, the last work in progress thing that we've got going on are these air Chrysal tanks. I purchased these things over in the Netherlands, and this is a very premature purchase, but I kind of had to pull the trigger. So these are from New Wave, a German brand, and I've been wanting to grow sea urchins here. But growing sea urchins is like a multi-step process. You kind of really have to start with like the phytoplankton and the zooplankton and stuff like that before you really get into the stage where you would need a tank like this. But I felt like I had to pull the trigger on this because getting Chrysal tanks in the US is kind of challenging. They're always like a custom project, it seems, and rather expensive. So when I was over there in the Netherlands at Vivarium, I was talking to Florian, and let's yeah, they've got a standard product that they have. I checked on the price, and the price is like super reasonable. And I was like, okay, well, how do I get these back? Because as a traveler, I am all about making travel as easy as possible and super smooth and fluid. Uh, One way to screw that up is trying to bring back delicate acrylic tanks on an international flight. That is oversized, but it was worth it. I got them back here. They are flawless, no chips, no dents. And eventually, when we figure out the phytoplankton portion, we can then get into breeding the actual sea urchins and getting their larvae going in these things. Chrysal tanks can be used for all kinds of things. Typically, you see them for jellyfish, but they are really good for any kind of like free swimming larvae that you might see, like tuxedo urchins. I have no illusions that we're going to be getting to this anytime soon, but it is one of those things that is on the to-do list. All right, guys, that pretty much does it for here. Hopefully, the next time you see a building update of any kind, everything will be done, right? And hopefully also there will be no new projects in the works. I really need to chill out. Yeah, fat chance, right? Anyway, you guys, thanks so much for hanging out, and I'll see you next time. Happy reefing.